Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Donald Miyazaki. I'm the executive director of the ALS Society of BC, and it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome you to the third series of the ALS BC patient webinar series presented by Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma Canada. Big thanks once again to Sophie and Andy at the team at Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma Canada for supporting this initiative and allowing us to have these presentations available for patients and caregivers and the ALS community throughout. Also, a big thank you to the ALS BC Patient Services team, Alexandra Guerrero and Maria Montoya, for your continued hard work in allowing us to have these events. Today we had 50 people in attendance who have registered, and I notice that they continually trickle in. So welcome everybody. Um, let's get right into it. It is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Tracy Chalmers, who is a founder of Endwell and a facilitator at Douglas College. She is also co-founder of the Grief Well and founding director of the End-of-life Doula Association of Canada. End-of-life Doula, certified force therapy guide, and hospice volunteer. Tracy is a friend to grief and a servant to many. She has just published her first book, The Nature of the Journey, a trail guide for companioning your person on the end-of-life journey. A perpetual student, Tracy lives on the Coast Salish land known as the North Shore of Vancouver. I just learned that she was my neighbor growing up. I'm also from the North Shore in West Vancouver. Speaking on the topic of an end-of-life doula's perspective, living with change, it's my honor to introduce and welcome Tracy Chalmers. Tracy.
Oh, thank you so much, Donald. It is such an honor to be here and to talk about something as important as grief. Thank you so much for having me. So I did prepare a slideshow to guide us through our conversation this afternoon. So I am going to share my screen and we'll just jump right in. Okay. So the title of the conversation this afternoon is Grieving as You Go, honoring anticipatory grief on the ALS journey. And the subtitle is a conversation about change, loss, and love. So this is a little overview of what we are going to be doing for the next hour. Well, after Donald's introduction, we've pretty much covered that. We are going to get really clear on what grief is. It is quite a misunderstood topic, and we are quite a grief illiterate bunch. So we'll get really clear on what grief is, what anticipatory grief is, how grief shows up. It shows up in so many ways. It is definitely a holistic response. We will also take part in some grief practice. I will just say up front that this is by invitation. If you do not have the capacity or the desire to participate in the grief practices I have woven into this presentation, that is okay. Grief is so personal and doesn't always feel like being engaged with. So just honoring your personal boundaries and saying no thank you is a beautiful way to care for yourself. But there will be a couple opportunities to take part in grief practice. We'll get really clear on what it looks like to honor grief, to live well with grief, and also how to support people who are grieving. There'll be plenty of time after the slide presentation for questions as well. We'll have about 20 minutes for a Q&A. So having said that, if you find that questions are arising as I am speaking and as we're going through these slides, feel free to either put them in the chat or hang on to them, and you can ask them at the end of the slideshow. So again, Donald did quite a thorough introduction. So I won't share too much. I will just add that I do serve as an end-of-life doula. And just to be clear, this is an emerging role in healthcare. So some people are unfamiliar with what an end-of-life doula does to support folks on the end-of-life journey. So just being a doula is really holistic wraparound support that's offered to people who have a life-limiting illness and their families. So it's a focus on the emotional, relational, spiritual layers of the journey. And it's really about being a companion. The role of a doula is non-medical and really is centered around taking the lead of the people that we're serving, offering education, perhaps advocacy, and connecting people with other resources in the community or online. It's really about walking alongside as people face an enormous amount of change and loss on the journey. So I'm going to jump right in with a quote by Alicia Alexander that says, "Grief is a universal response to change." That may seem like a different definition of grief than perhaps you that might come to mind. But I really think that this is the most inclusive definition of grief that I've ever come across. And I think it's very accurate. So a couple of years ago, I was asked by some folks at Douglas College to create a course on grief and bereavement. And I felt very interested to do this. I was really excited, and I'm very familiar with grief with the work I have been involved in for the last decade or more, supporting people at end of life and also creating the Grief Well as a resource for people who are grieving. So I felt really excited about this invitation. And when I sat down to start writing that course, I remember sitting there in front of my computer and seeing this little 5-letter word like grief. Okay, so where do I start? How do we define grief? And most of the definitions that were coming up when I was Google searching grief were all related to bereavement, so to death-related loss. And they didn't seem to be inclusive enough to all the different types of grief that we as human beings encounter. And so I found this definition by Alicia Alexander, who identifies as a grief expert. She lives in the United States. I found this to be the most inclusive definition of grief. So grief is a universal response to change. So of course it can involve the death of a person, but it also involves any time a change happens. So on the ALS journey, there is so much change. Maybe it's change of the ability to speak or move or independence. And all these things can shift so quickly, sometimes week by week. And this is how these little changes, when perhaps we don't acknowledge them as being grief, they aren't always given the attention they need, and they can really pile up over time and roll in quite quickly. And this can lead to feeling quite overwhelmed and quite heavy. It can feel really heavy. So that's why I like to frame this talk, grieving as you go, because grief isn't something that we wait to do at the end. It's something that unfolds all along the way. So I'm really curious, how can we be well on the journey and sort of travel light? I like to think of traveling on the journey as like you would any trip you'd go on. You don't want to bring too much luggage. And grief that isn't acknowledged, grief that builds up without giving the space it needs to be witnessed, can really weigh people down. If it's not expressed, if it's not shared with trusted others. And actually, that's where the word grief comes from. It comes from the Latin word gravis, meaning heavy. And grief can truly feel heavy, especially when these losses come in one after another. So for those living with a life-limiting illness, these accumulation of non-death losses can really be exhausting. So I'm going to pull up another quote by Buddhist practitioner and palliative care nurse Sally Tisdale. And this is a quote that really speaks to those little or not so little non-death losses that can accumulate on the journey. Sally Tisdale writes, "Dying is a state of ongoing loss. Hair, teeth, erections, the ability to tie shoes or carry groceries, breasts, vision, attention span, the evening walk, driving, the strength to climb stairs, to do the laundry and housework, bladder control, a sense of smell, balance. Relationships disappear, plans are revoked, social roles are extinguished." That's a lot. So when we can now name what these things are, each one of these things listed on this slide is grief worthy. And if we don't honor that, this loss can really be relentless. But when we understand what grief is and what it asks for, we can offer support that lightens the load. And grief's greatest need is to be witnessed. So as a companion to someone who is on the journey, you hold the medicine for grief by simply being there, by seeing how enormous these things are for your person, by hearing them and maybe express how hard these things are and really honoring that. Even a simple empathic statement like, "That's a lot," is enough to allow people to really understand that you're feeling with them and that they are not alone. I will also add, when we talk about grief, it is very much shaped by many things, how we express it. So grief is shaped by our culture. It's shaped by gender norms, social stories that we have absorbed, and so these do influence how emotions are expressed, and they also impact how support is given or withheld. So some examples of this are in Western cultures, men have been taught to appear strong and to hide their vulnerability. And women, on the other hand, have often been encouraged to quiet perhaps their anger. So both of these messages are things to be aware of because they may restrict healthy grieving. It's really hopeful to see that these norms are changing. As our understanding of gender and emotion expands, we seem to be creating more space for authentic grief expression. But I do think it's important to be aware of these cultural influences and gender norms because it can help bring more awareness, and that in and of itself is protective, but also it brings compassion to ourselves and to others as we navigate loss together. So just to pause here and just reflect on what has been shared already. So honoring that grief is the response to change. Honoring that even just being a human being in today's world is incredibly griefy. There's a lot of collective grief, and I'm quite interested in the work of Francis Weller, who's a psychotherapist who wrote a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and he talks about the 5 gates of grief that lead to the house of sorrow. And he identifies a number of different causes of grief for us modern day humans, things like not living in a tribal like setting, being disconnected from nature can be griefy, ancestral grief, the grief of our ancestors can be griefy, collective grief, the state of the world, the state of the environment. So let's just honor that there is a lot of grief going on just in day-to-day life. And then with the onset of a life-limiting illness diagnosis, it's like there's another other causes of grief happening, like this slide states, all these non-death losses that aren't always given the space they need. And I would say that's also layered with a level of anticipatory grief. So anticipatory grief is a grief response And it happens the moment a life-limiting diagnosis is given. And it doesn't just happen, it's not a response that just happens in the person who is given this life-limiting illness diagnosis. It is something that all people who care about this person will experience. So on this slide, anticipatory grief is defined as an experience of loss that occurs before an anticipated event. Anticipatory grief happens after a life-limiting illness diagnosis. It affects the person with the diagnosis as well as everyone else connected to that person. Anticipatory grief is the response to a cascade of losses that occur when death is expected. These losses may include the loss of an imagined future, changing roles in the family, financial changes, the loss of security, and the foreseeable death. So, like all types of grief, anticipatory grief evokes an unpredictable range of responses. And often this grief, even though it seems abstract, this grief felt before a death can feel even more intense and can be even more stressful than the grief that comes after. So, like all types of grief, anticipatory grief it's a whole person experience. It impacts people effectively, behaviorally, cognitively, somatically. So this grief experience of anticipatory grief often includes anger as well, and a general loss of emotional control, which adds to heightened anxiety, right? So it's really complicated and confusing and exhausting. And in my role as an end-of-life doula, I can't tell you how many times people have contacted me in this state of overwhelm and used the word crazy. Like, I feel like I'm going crazy. Maybe they, share some different responses that they're having to their situation. And what I've found time and time again is if I can name it, if I can say, well, normalize first, of course you're feeling that way. This is anticipatory grief, and explain how that manifests. It's amazing to see how people seem to be really comforted by that, which allows them to be less fearful, which allows them to be more present. This idea of normalizing, naming, it's like we don't know what's happening because we don't talk about grief enough and we're not very grief literate. So I think there's so much power in sharing this information. I'm really excited that all of you are here, and maybe some of you in this moment are going, oh my gosh, this is what I have been living with, and it does make sense. So I hope that sharing information can often bring comfort. So anticipatory grief, unfortunately, doesn't allow you to get a head start on your grief. It actually extends the period of mourning. So it's this experience of loss. It's like, it's in addition to the loss that you will feel after the death of your person, but it can be adaptive. So it may help you prepare for what is ahead. And oftentimes there's almost a silver lining to anticipatory grief. It often motivates people to address unresolved issues, say what needs to be said. Maybe that looks like an offering of forgiveness or gratitude or love. And it really does encourage people to make the most of the time that's remaining. So it can really help you and your person find meaning on the end of life journey, which is a positive thing for sure. Okay, let's see what's on the next slide. Okay, so we're going to look now at how grief shows up. So this refers to all types of grief. Again, this could be death-related loss. It could be non-death loss. It could be anticipatory grief. So on the following slide, I'm going to share with you a chart. It's from a research study conducted by Margaret Strobe, and it's a very helpful chart. I have used it before in settings where I'm sharing information on grief, and it's just in real time. You can almost see people relax, understanding that, seeing themselves in this chart, because it really does show how varied people's responses can be to grief. So I just wanted to, on this slide, let you know that I think it's quite interesting that the lead researcher in this grief study that I'm going to share with you in a moment, she was actually someone that didn't ever really like literature in high school. She was quite science driven and went on to do a lot of incredible work in the realm of grief, and the intersection of grief and research. However, later in her career, she began to understand that it is really helpful to look to the humanities to get a better understanding of grief. So she actually ended up conducting a meta-analysis on poetry, and she really honors that, grief is not predictable, and it doesn't come in stages, and it is the most humanizing experience. And so although science can lead us to understand a great deal about grief, that it is really the poets and other people in the humanities that can really guide us as to how to what's normal and what grief is like. So let's look at the chart. So these are the reactions to bereavement from Margaret Strobe and team. This is a study done in 2007. And I'll just give you a moment to read through this chart. You can see it really honors that grief is a holistic experience, impacting us effectively, cognitively, behaviorally, and psychologically and somatically. And you can just take a moment and read through the reactions to bereavement. I once heard a grief expert, Megan Devine, who's the author of the book It's Okay That You're Not Okay, mention that we think that sadness is the gold standard of grief. That's the response most of us are familiar with, and most of us assign to grief. And yet grief can look like so much more. It's so unpredictable. You can see why it really can make people feel out of control and emotionally exhausted. And each loss elicits a different grief response. So people don't grieve the same as it's not as you have your way of grieving. Each loss is different, which makes it even more feral, even more wild. Some of you might feel grief in your shoulders, or as a knot in your stomach, or restless energy, or disrupted sleep. It really does live in your body. And I think this really speaks to the fact how these are signals from your nervous system that something really precious is at risk. And this is that connection between grief and love. Because, and with these extended periods of caregiving too, because anticipatory grief, and not just caregiving, for people on the journey themselves, people living with a life-limiting illness diagnosis, and the incredible change that people go through. Grief can last weeks, months, even years. And so the body can enter a state of chronic vigilance, kind of almost always on alert and waiting for the loss to arrive. And that can be really exhausting, unless we look closely at how we can be well with grief. And we're going to do that in a moment. Another really misunderstood aspect of grief is anger. And this is really common in anticipatory grief. And anger, it actually often stems from the fear of losing something we care about. Yet in this dominant culture, anger is seen as something bad, especially when expressed by women. And so unfortunately, this can silence us. But anger is definitely a messenger, and it can really guide us to what feels unjust or unbearable. And it really reminds us of what matters most. So I think it's really important to be careful that we're not suppressing our grief experience, even if it's something like anger. It's part of grief's language. Anger can become a teacher. We could get curious about what it's here to tell us, because that's really what we're getting at. Embracing grief, which is the goal, having a kinship with grief, is welcoming all of it, even if the emotions, are uncomfortable. Feelings aren't good or bad, right? They're just signals calling for our attention and care. And grief really asks us to slow down and to listen. And that's how we can be well with our grief. I often think it's funny in this culture where people are so in pursuit of happiness. If they would only understand that the only true way to be happy is to truly be sad. I mean, you can't just pick the intensity of one emotion. You're either deeply feeling or you're not. So, it's a way of engaging with all of life, is to feel deeply. And grief, definitely, it's not comfortable, but it can ask us to feel more deeply. The neat thing too, I just want to mention while looking at this slide is, just looking at the physical responses to loss. If we recognize that grief does definitely manifest in the body, it also opens up a world of possibilities for expression, because grief isn't an abstraction. It's something that can be expressed through movement or breath or dance or art or yoga or martial arts, whatever those practices are. They can allow grief to move and shift, and it can allow grief to be given the space to be expressed and experienced and released and honored. So I hope this slide really is a strong example of how grief is not just a feeling, it's a full body, full person experience. And it's really about acknowledging all forms of grief that can be profoundly healing. So here we are at our grief practice. So I just will say one more time, if you're joining late or didn't hear me the first time, this is an invitation. If you do not have the capacity to engage in this grief practice at this time, that's okay. Grief really asks us to check in with our boundaries, our personal boundaries, being what's okay and what's not okay with you. So if you're not feeling like exploring losses in this moment, that's okay. That's a beautiful gesture of self-care to say no. If you would like to participate, we are going to take a few minutes, and the invitation is, now that we're really clear on what grief is, this universal response to change, and now that we're clear on what anticipatory grief is, I'd like you to take the time to consider the non-death losses that you have experienced so far on your ALS journey, either as someone with an ALS diagnosis or a caregiver of someone or companion of someone who is living with ALS. So these can be tangible losses, such as physical abilities, the loss of activities or jobs, or these can be more abstract losses, such as the losses of identity, future dreams, changing roles in the family, loss of security, and the foreseeable death. Now, I will say this sounds incredibly heavy, and it is not a light exercise. And sometimes people are reluctant to engage in grief work because they almost feel like if they take the lid off, they won't be able to put it back on. They may drown in their sorrows. But if you're in this room and you're listening to this talk, you are already sad. You are already grieving. And what this exercise is, it's the opportunity to connect with and share your experience. And this is the medicine for grief. So it's only when we don't look at our grief that it festers, that it closes up, that we see things like depression, dullness, despair. But it's when we can gently turn towards it when it feels right to you. And again, this may not be the right time, and that's okay. but this is how we travel more lightly. So for those of you that want to participate, you can take a few moments and write down the losses that you've experienced so far. Make a list of all the changes that you're living with. And I'll just put my timer on for a few minutes. So just another minute to finish off your list of losses. If you can just finish up what you're writing, if you chose to participate. Okay. And for some, that might have brought a sense of relief, even just to write something down and to really acknowledge the enormity of what you're going through. And for this, we're asked to practice self-compassion, that same kindness that you want to give yourself, that you would give someone else you're trying to comfort, to just really honor what you're going through. It's a lot. It's enormous. It's the biggest thing. And you may feel called to share your grief with someone else after today. Maybe it's something that you haven't shared with anybody. Maybe you want to call a friend, or you might want to journal, or maybe you'll want to go for a long walk in the park and think about these things, or maybe you want to burn this list and let it go. You can do whatever you like with it, but this step of acknowledging and naming is deeply impactful. It's the first longing of grief. Grief has two longings, and acknowledging grief is the first. So how do we honor grief? And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, oftentimes simply just understanding what grief is, that grief literacy piece, and naming it, saying, this is grief. This validates your experience. And I think coupled with that too is that self-compassion piece. You know, of course you're feeling overwhelmed. Of course you're feeling whatever it is, blank, because you are going through so much. So naming it, validating it, normalizing it. You're not going crazy, you're grieving. And what you care about most is uncertain. And that's huge. Another way to honor grief is through tiny rituals, or not so tiny, but a ritual is simply an action with intention. And the reason why grief and rituals go so well together is because of that action piece. So grief is the first longing of grief, as I mentioned before, is to acknowledge the loss on a personal level. So for those of you that participated in the grief practice, you've now acknowledged your grief on a personal level. And to just be with the feelings that arise. That's really the first longing of grief. And the second longing of grief is for grief to be seen and heard. So we are communal beings. We are not meant to journey alone. We are meant to share our experiences with trusted others. And rituals, being actions with intentions, allow for mourning. And mourning is simply the internal experience of grief being brought out into the world. So maybe it's lighting a candle. That's an action with intention. It could be writing a journal. You could create a playlist. You could have a grief ritual you do with another person. So maybe you are a companion of someone on the ALS journey, or you are the person living with ALS and you have a companion. And maybe this is resonating and you're feeling the need to give these losses more space. Well, if a loss occurs, a non-death loss, you can take the time, slow down, maybe light a candle for that loss that has happened. And in this way, you can keep up with and metabolize these losses as they come in so that you don't feel so congested. You can keep up with them. Rituals are simply actions with intentions. You can do them alone. You can do them with the partner. You can do them in a group. And it's whatever action feels right for you. You could have a grief dance and dance it out. It could be anything. So it really speaks to this second longing of grief, sharing your grief with trusted others. And this will allow the medicine of witnessing to support your experience of loss. So if you are lucky enough to have even one person in your life who is a good listener, people that can listen to your experience, that can really feel with you and let you know you're not alone, this is the medicine for grief. And for some people, that might be a counselor or a mental health, another, someone else on the health care team. Maybe it's not your closest person, and that's okay. So we can honor grief in ways beyond words. It's one of the most profound ways to support another person who's grieving is to sit with them, not say anything at all. That's almost like giving the loss all this space to stretch out, or offering touch or presence when words don't feel like enough. And just a note too on the permission to feel both. And so grief isn't just, all these negative feelings. You can feel joy and grief in the same moment. So just giving yourself that permission to focus on life and to really honor those moments of laughter, and they do not cancel out sorrow. So this is a prompt for you. We're not going to do it right now because I want to make sure we have time for questions. But maybe after today, you want to take some time and consider what holds you in times of grief. Is it a trusted friend or a family member? Maybe it's an element of the natural world. A lot of people talk about really vast natural landscapes as being places big enough to hold their grief, like a forest or an ocean. Maybe there's activities you do that allow you to feel supported in grief. Maybe it's writing or running or listening to music. So the invitation is to write your name in the center of a blank piece of paper and take some time to acknowledge the people, places, and practices that bring you comfort when you're grieving, and really take time to reflect on what holds you and express gratitude for those things that you have that you can lean out on. And gratitude truly is a radical act. This is a quote by Diana Butler Bass that says, "Gratitude takes us from abstract belief to living compassion in the world. Gratitude is strongest, clearest, most robust, and radical when things are really hard, really hard. All is lost hard." And for those of you here today, things are likely really hard. And gratitude is a choice, and it's a beautiful balance to grief. Francis Weller, who wrote The Wild Edge of Sorrow, says it's the role of the mature human to hold grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and be stretched by these two opposing forces. So if you're feeling really griefy and overwhelmed, it can be a powerful practice to consider what it is you're grateful for and really anchor into what you have. So we're not going to do this now because we're short on time, but maybe later on today or another day, you can think of 3 things you're grateful for. They don't have to be big things. Maybe it's just a warm cup of tea or the sound of a bird. Maybe it's noticing your breath. Gratitude does not erase worry, but it can soften its edges and remind us that even in difficult times, life offers moments of beauty, comfort, and connection. When we pause to notice what's good, even when it's hard, we can invite a little more lightness into our day. So really, just to summarize, how do we support people who are grieving? So this is yourself, it's others. Caring for each other while living with ALS can look like validating and normalizing grief. Like, of course you're feeling that way. Of course you're having that experience. It can look like slowing down and creating space for the grief to be honored. It can be serving as a witness to really see people, hear people, feel deeply with people, so that your person can keep up with the many losses as they roll in. And this is a little blurry, but I just think this is an important final slide. This is called the ring theory, and it was created by Susan Silk, who was a psychologist. She did have breast cancer for a while, and a lot of her work is based on how to care for people in times of crisis. And without going into too much detail, I just want to explain the way the theory works is the person with the life-limiting illness is in the center of these concentric rings. And each ring radiating out reflects different levels of intimacy. So the primary caregiver is right in that first ring, then close friends and family, and then other friends and family. And this can extend out to colleagues, neighbors, or anyone else who's impacted by the prognosis. And the way that this ring theory works is that you always support inwards. So you're always offering support inwards, and support almost always looks like active listening, like true presence, deep listening is what people mostly want when they're in struggle. And so another way to look at this is you receive support by leaning out. So I think many of you here are in those first two rings. You're either the person living with the diagnosis of ALS, or you're someone very close to that person. So this ring theory is an invitation to remember, support in, listen deeply, bring your presence, and lean out. So, who do you have in your world that is, a little bit less close to the center that you can look to for support? And this is where it can get tricky when your two people in the same household are living with such enormous loss. How can we find people? And this is where the role of an end-of-life doula is someone that's quite a few rings out that can kind of almost hold the whole situation. But this can look like many other people. Maybe it's a friend or a colleague, or a counselor. But I think this is an important slide that can inform us how to show up appropriately. Lean in for support, or lean out for support and support in. So in closing, I just want to reinforce that anticipatory grief reminds us of two truths. It's the depth of our love and the inevitability of change. It's not wasted sorrow. It really is the way that our heart practices letting go. I have one quote I just pulled up here that I'd like to read to you. It's from Joanna Macy, who's a Buddhist scholar. And she writes, "We are called not to run from the discomfort and not run from grief or the feelings of outrage or even fear. And if we can be fearless to be with our pain, it turns. It doesn't stay static. It only doesn't change if we refuse to look at it. But when we look at it, when we take it in our hands, when we can just be with it and keep breathing, it turns. It turns to reveal its other face. And the other face of our pain for the world is our love for the world, our absolutely inseparable connectedness with all of life." Before I officially end the presentation, I just wanted to let you know that the book I've just finished reading is going to be released on October the 25th, and I am having a book launch at Banyan Books. If any of you are interested in coming, saying hello, that'll be November 14th. It's a free event at 7:30. And I just want to thank you all so much for sharing this space with me. Thank you to the ALS Society for inviting me to be here today. And if you'd like to reach out after this presentation, my contact information is here. You can reach me at tlc@endwell.ca. I really hope that you're feeling validated and equipped to move forward with grief and a little bit less alone on your journey. And I'd love to hear your questions and your thoughts and anything that you'd like to share from your own experience. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Tracy. We'll maybe give it a couple minutes to see if anybody wanted to type in any questions. But I really jumped the gun when I said you literally just wrote a book. You literally just wrote the book. It's not even out yet. I was looking on Tracy's website is endwell.ca, and her website has just a whole bunch of resources. And I did see that the book is you can pre-order it now. It doesn't come out until October 28th, and it looks like Indigo and Amazon and other channels where you can pre-order. But looks like some great information. Obviously, what you presented today. We're very grateful for your time and your information. Tracy comes very highly recommended from our friends at the Provincial Respiratory Outreach Program and Technology for Independent Living. The folks there who had highly recommended us reach out to Tracy, and we could see why. So thank you so much for sharing. But yeah, your website does have a whole bunch of great resources that I had a chance to take a look at. Please do visit endwell.ca.
And for more specific grief resources, the Grief Passion Project I've created with my partner Willow Miley is the griefwell.ca. So there's more specific grief resources over there as well. Yeah. Oh.
Waiting to see if just a lot of thank yous. So far, I see. Just one of the previous questions that came up. We are recording these as we mentioned, and we might need a couple days to kind of edit it, but they will be available on our website once under the educational resources tab or educational webinars or resources tab that we have on our website. We'll make sure that it's uploaded there with web educational webinars. There we go. Tab at alsbc.ca. We'll make sure it's uploaded there as we kind of wait the final moments here before maybe more questions pop up. Our webinars do take place every second Tuesday of the month. In the odd times, there are statutory holidays that fall on a Tuesday, like it is in November. It's actually going to be on November 18th. That'll be our next webinar, given that the second Tuesday is Remembrance Day. November 11th, we are going to have our webinar on November 18th. We're just in the final stages of finalizing a speaker for that, but it is likely going to be on the psychological support, on the theme of psychological support with people living with ALS. As always, as the death doula presentation came from recommendations, we're always open to hearing from the ALS community on who you want to hear us reach out to and have speak at our educational webinar presentations. If you have any recommendations, we're not here to tell you what to learn. We want to share what other people in the community want to hear. So please do reach out to Alexandra or Marie with any recommendations that you may have for future presentations. And I think we do have one question. I don't know if you see it there. Just so, what experience prompt you to choose this as your career?
Oh, yeah, I think a simple answer would be just over 10 years ago, I started volunteering at North Shore Hospice. And I just, one thing is it's an honor to be there, and I really feel comfortable holding space for loss and helping people navigate the journey. And I also saw just such a huge need. And really, the role of end of life doula is to bridge any gaps in care. I like to say it's like being like water and flowing to where the need is. So I just saw so many gaps in care and so many needs that it really inspired me to consider what can I do to meet the needs of people who are on the end of life journey. And so I took a bit of a career change. Yeah, thanks for asking.
How long ago was that? Do you mind if I ask? Did you say 10 years ago?
I've been at hospice for just over 10 years, and I took the doula course at Douglas College back in 2017. So not that long ago. But it
Yeah.
was such a different time. There wasn't even the role of end of life doula wasn't even defined. When we started the association, we wrote the body of knowledge and the scope of practice and created that center for excellence for the profession. But it's just a very much an emerging role in healthcare. So yeah. Yeah.
Amazing. One more question. How do you take care of yourself while carrying all of the emotions from other people?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's sort of a before, during, and after approach. I think I'm very intentional before I spend time with people to do some exercises around protection and just making sure that I'm well rested and that I feel grounded and comfortable. And then when I'm with a person dealing with a lot of emotion, I really try to imagine myself almost being like a sieve, feeling very deeply with others, but allowing the experience to flow through me. So I'm not holding what's not mine to carry. And there is a lot of work afterwards of really having an awareness. I think awareness is so self-protective. So just being aware of, am I carrying something that's not mine to carry, and working on ways, rituals or ways I can release the grief, because it's this fine balance between feeling deeply and acting wisely, and also not getting too weighed down by loss and sadness. And I find one of the most effective forms of self-care is just ordinary life, just putting the focus back on life. So being with my family and my favorite people and eating my favorite foods, and just the simple things, hugging my kids, bring me back to the wonder of life that's here for me so that I can stay present. But I think it's a good question. And I think it's an important question because I think that it's hard to offer intimacy at scale. So you really have to keep up and have that awareness of metabolizing the grief that you're experiencing from others, or else you can get quite congested. So yeah, takes work, lots of walks in the forest.
This is a good segue to the next question. Do you get emotional when helping others, like crying with them, or is it better for you not to?
No, I absolutely do cry with people when I'm evoked, because this is human work. And I think crying shows people that I care too, and I'm feeling deeply. But I always keep that ring theory in the back of my mind. So my role as a doula, because I'm those rings out, is to always support in. So I can cry as long as I'm not crying more than people in rings smaller than me. And I can feel deeply as long as I'm the one that's still offering support in. And when I'm done, then I can go back into my life and lean out on the people, practices, and things that offer me support. Yeah.
Amazing human work. That's a very good way of putting what you do. Thank you for all that you do. And I don't see any more questions, and we are at the top of the hour. So maybe we'll close it there. Tracy, thank you so much on behalf of ALSBC for joining us and your presentation. It really was an honor for us to have you.
Amazing. It was an honor to be here. Thank you so much.
Great.